Hi, good morning. We are Group 9. My name is BQ and my group mates are Ray, Sean, Joe, and Jay. Today we'll be talking about the Rohingya genocide. So let's move on to the table of contents. I will be presenting the introduction and covering the ethical dilemma and moral agents in the case of the study. Each of my teammates will be tackling a moral agent and cover the theological and the deontological aspects of it. Ray will be tackling the military, followed by Sean, who will be discussing about Facebook. Then Joe will be talking about the state media, and lastly, Jay will be talking about the perspectives of the Rohingya people. I will wrap up the entire presentation and with the conclusion and the discussion questions. If you have yet to heard about the Rohingya crisis, genocide, or whatsoever you want to put a name on it, then shame on you, because this happened within our region, and I cannot help myself but to know that even Boris Johnson, or BJ, if you want to call him that, was concerned by the situation, and the Queen of Rohingya of Jordan herself paid a visit to the refugees in Bangladesh. So now moving on to the ethical dilemma. I believe that pictures convey 1,000 words, and by showing you the pictures and the title of the presentation, you should be able to know what the ethical dilemma is. Each picture shown, it's a part of each of our moral agents act. So now moving on to the moral agents, first I'll be talking about the military. So Myanmar was granted independence in 1948 as a democratic nation. Following a coup d'etat that happened in 1962, it became a military dictatorship under the Burma Socialist Program Party, according to BBC 2018. So in 2011, a military junta was officially dissolved following a 2010 general election. And it's a normally quasi-civilian government parliament. Moving on to Facebook. So one of the major milestones to the changing media landscape in Myanmar is the 2011 to allow foreign media into the country. For millions of Myanmar citizens, it is the first time that they experience internet technology. And Facebook was a dominative platform synonymous to the internet instead of search engine like Google or Yahoo. This result of their aggressive market capitalization of market share via the Facebook Free Basics program. So what is this program about? This program, Free Basics, makes the internet accessible to more people by providing them access to a free range of services like news, communication, and local government information for developing countries. This is from the Facebook for Developers website. So now moving on to the state media. So another milestone that the pre-publication of press censorship ended in 2012, according to Lee 2019. Before that, cases that were deemed sensitive and challenging by the military authorities were heavily censored and edited. Information has to generate from somewhere. Secondary was Facebook. So primary, it came from the Myanmar's state media publication called the New Global Light of Myanmar. And you have to know that they are owned under Myanmar's Ministry of Information, which go all the way up to the parliament. So right now I'll be talking about the Rohingya people. They are Muslim settlers that came to the Arakan state in about 1430s. Why I asterisk the Arakan state? Because in 1784, according to Blakemore 2019, the Burmese Empire attacked the Arakan state, and which is now the Rakhine state that is the modern Myanmar that we know today. The Rohingya are also the descendants of Muslim immigrants from Eastern Bengal, and they were welcomed by British colonizers to look for cheap labor force in the 19th century. However, they are not considered as one of the country's 135 official ethnic groups and have been denied citizenship in Myanmar since 1982. Now I shall pass my time on to Ray, who will be talking about the Myanmar military.
Thank you, BQ. Okay, so now let's all take a look at the Myanmar military and the massive role that they played in this very unfortunate event. So just as a quick refresher, teleology, okay, we're going to look at the Myanmar military first in a teleological perspective. So teleology is pretty much synonymous with consequentialism, which, as the name suggests, focuses on the consequence of a decided ethical action. So I see it apt to kickstart the teleological perspective with its most prominent and widely studied theory, which is utilitarianism. As we are all familiar with, utilitarianism is basically the consequence that provides the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is what we learned, but upon further research, we actually found a piece of literature that shed light on a very dark and grim side of utilitarianism. And there is a dimension in utilitarianism itself that justifies death and other forms of violence, radically departing from common sense morality as we know it as laypeople. This is discussed thoroughly in the paper that we cited by Kahane et al. In 2018, and this theory is called instrumental harm. So this is the definition of instrumental harm. We are permitted and even required to instrumentally use, severely harm, or even kill innocent people to promote the greater good. So taking that into consideration and bringing it to the theological perspective, we can see that this ordeal is very similar to that of the Nazis in World War II. Obviously, this is a genocide. But here, the Myanmar military's goal that they would stop at nothing to achieve was to protect and retain their race and their religion, being Buddhism. It's also worth reinstating here that in the Rakhine state, that's where the Rohingya people are. That was the birthplace of Buddhism in Myanmar itself, and hence it is an extremely sacred place to the nation as well as the military. And that is why it's so important to them to protect the sanctity of the origin of their nation's religious beliefs. So because of this, the military and the people of Myanmar themselves felt threatened, and they felt worried and angered that the Rohingyas may inject Islam into that state, and then from there it would spread across the country. So to them, wiping the race out entirely was the smartest move to achieve those goals, because if you were to do the math from a utilitarian perspective, this consequence of them being wiped out or gone from the country would result in greater happiness and a greater outcome than before for the greatest number of people, considering that the Myanmar people and the military are the majority in the country. And hence, it is the greatest good for the greatest number. Now let's look at the Myanmar military from a deontological perspective. So here in deontology, what we focus on are actions and intentions and motives that lead up to the consequence and not the consequences themselves. As you can see on this slide, there is another theory that we provide here, which is called the principle of permissible harm, that also rationalizes acts of violence and harm. It's very similar to instrumental harm that I just explained. However, there is a subtle but significant difference between these two that differentiate them from being either teleological or deontological. So from before, instrumental harm kind of states that you have to do this act because the consequence is dependent on you doing the act. So it's more aligned with consequence. But for this one, it's more of a only do this act if it will somehow result in or is directly related to the greater good upon doing this act. Otherwise, it is not permissible to do so. So it's more aligned with the intention of committing this action. And as I mentioned earlier about the sanctity of Myanmar's race and religion and the importance it has to the military, it was hence deemed permissible to carry out these harmful acts on the Rohingya, as it would eventually lead towards the greater good for the greatest number, which is the people of Myanmar. In addition to that, we can see there is this thing called downstream theory quoted by Woolard in 2008. He states that the principle of permissible harm is a variation of downstream theory, meaning that the harm, such as killing or wiping out a race, is deemed permissible because it is directly related to the goal that they are trying to achieve. If they were to do another act, such as trafficking the children and women of the Rohingya people, then that would become impermissible and would be more evil than actually killing out the entire race as a whole, because trafficking these women and children is not directly related to achieving the goal that they're trying to achieve here. Yeah. Okay, so now, deontological perspective, let's take a look at the two famous theoretical insights here, which is the rights and justice theory. I'm going to quickly recap each of these theories because they will be occurring throughout the presentation over and over again. So first, rights theory. This theory basically states that any action that infringes one's rights is unethical, and we are to act in accordance to the moral that everyone is entitled to human rights. So looking at the military from the rights theory perspective, we can see that they clearly violated the human rights of the Rohingya people by performing such horrible acts on them. And so, yeah. Now moving on to justice theory. This is the fancy definition, but to put it simply, justice theory states that ethical decisions should be made with equality and impartiality and ensuring the fair treatment of all people. So bringing this back to the military's perspective, we need to take note of this thing called the ARSA, which will be further elaborated on by Jay later. But the ARSA is basically abbreviated for Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army and is made up of volunteered Rohingya people. The important thing about this to know is that not all of the Rohingya people belong to the ARSA. So theoretically speaking, when we look at it from the justice theory perspective, it would prove to be unjust and unfair in terms of the act from the military because they attacked everybody in the race of Rohingya instead of just those who were involved. All right, so now let's move on to the next moral agent, which is Facebook, and Sean will take it from here.
Thank you, Ray. I will now be focusing on Facebook as a moral agent. According to Taylor 2020, Facebook is a corporation that produces 16 billion in sales annually, but has committed very little resources towards identifying hate speech in Myanmar. With little resources allocated to this group of people, hate speech and aggressive posts remain undetected. There were only 2 people at Facebook at that point of time in 2015 who could speak Burmese. According to 2020, and they were the only 2 people analyzing the problematic posts. Despite taking time to get hold of the information regarding the anti-Rohingyas propaganda, Facebook dealt with the issue professionally pertaining to the teleological perspective. Firstly, under the system of ethics, Facebook took accountability for their actions. Mia Garlick, Facebook's Director of Asia Pacific Policy, admitted that they were too slow to respond to concerns raised by civil society and other groups in Myanmar. Next, Facebook also adhered to the principles of moral behavior. After Facebook had knowledge of what was happening, they had the moral sensitivity, which is awareness that ethical issues are part of the situation, according to Chamber 2011. They recognized the ethical dilemma at hand, which led them to be able to correctly judge the actions to be taken. They also added a section in the community guidelines that directly acknowledges the coordination of harmful events or public crime that states, we prohibit people from facilitating, organizing, promoting, or admitting to certain criminal or harmful activities targeted at people, businesses, property, or animals, according to community standards. By implementing this new law, it will restrict people from using Facebook as a medium for dishonorable purposes. Examples like hate speech or fake news. In addition, Facebook also showed moral motivation by accepting their responsibility and by taking down hundreds of accounts and pages connected to the Myanmar army or accounts encouraging malicious behavior. Facebook's decision to remove the accounts involved with the military who were promoting hate has encouraged people to be more wary about what they posted. This not only showed Facebook's moral character of persistence rather than taking the easy way out, it also changed the mindsets of people regarding social media and the content they choose to post. By acknowledging the fact that they were in the wrong and by taking the respective steps to improve the situation, Facebook showed that they were not afraid to admit to their mistakes and were ready to accept the consequences that follow. This could be a very essential for the future perspectives of the future prospective clients and partners of Facebook. In terms of deontological perspective, Facebook also used the rights theory. Once again, Mia Garlick states, we don't want Facebook to be used to spread hatred and incite violence. This could show that Facebook believes everyone deserves a humane degree of respect for their rights and no particular group or religion should be discriminated by another. This also proves that Facebook wanted to protect the rights not only of their users, but the rights of humanity as well, which would mean having to remove certain accounts that spread hatred and incite violence, which would in turn decrease their overall users. This was also cited by Taylor 2020. Next, I will pass my time to Jolene to shed light on the moral agent, state media.
Thanks a lot for that, Sean. Now we move into our third moral agent, the state media, or otherwise the media governing body in charge of the Rakhine state. Let's take a teleological viewpoint here. In an article by Lee in 2019, and also as briefed earlier by BQ, Myanmar's media restrictions are very strict, so much so that it is comparable to that of North Korea. Everything undergoes heavy editing and censorship. People's political views were mostly silenced due to the ruling of the military, and their ruling lasted until the year 2010, which was the year where they finally had an election in which 75% of the parliamentary seats were elected by voters. Now, despite most of the government being selected by voters, the military still had significant influence in the new government. Where the state media really plays their role in the whole situation is where do these ideas that were being spread on Facebook come from? All news has to be birthed somewhere, and the advent of anti-Rohingya communication was first published on Myanmar state media publication, a news source called Global New Light Myanmar. Now, keeping in mind that these ideas originate from the state media and that the military has a firm hold on the state and therefore has influence on the state media, I'll now explain the state media's point of view from a teleological standpoint. The state media looks at the Rohingya as people that terrorize the sanctity of their national primary religion, which is Buddhism, as well as the country in general. Decisions were therefore made based on the end result that the government anticipated to be beneficiary to the country. To elaborate further, the stand that they took is one that deems the military's response to retaliate to such terror to be both appropriate and necessary. This means that from a teleological perspective, the ethnic cleansing that took place was not only justified, it was also permitted, and often received praise due to the way in which the threat was being removed. Now let's take a deontological viewpoint. As I introduced earlier, the publication that the public turns to as a political news source, the Global New Light Myanmar, had a lot to do with the ideas that were spread on Facebook. While Facebook was put under a harsh light for their failure to properly monitor bad content against the good, the state media did in fact sow the first seeds. Agenda setting is where attitudes on what should be deemed important is influenced by the media. The way that the state media shifted the public's focus was that they insinuated a sort of civil emergency, so to speak, as Buddhism is an integral part of the country's religious culture, and any threat to something so nationally important and precious was deemed to be of great importance. It is also mentioned in the Lee 2019 article that headlines addressing the Rohingya as violent attackers and using distressing words such as emergency, killing. These were all subtle ways in which Myanmar's state influenced the people to think of the situation as one in which the country's security was being protected from danger. Basically, the way that the justice theory applies here is that they believe that by targeting the Rohingya-dominated area, they could then be able to seek justice by reinforcing fair treatment towards the religion of Buddhism, and ultimately the entire country. The state publication reasoned that it was the right of the country to maintain their Buddhist-originated state from Islamic ideology. This was effectively done in a similar way, where headlines included buzzwords like terrorists, destroy, eradicate, extremist, among many other very serious words. The rights theory is therefore seen here, where we can tell that the state media had a defense system of religious and cultural rights to justify the political decisions that were agreed upon. Now, I'll pass my time over to Jay, who will talk to you about the Rohingya population and the situation from their perspective. Take it away, Jay. Thanks.
Thank you, Jolene. So talking a little bit about the Rohingya people, here's a little recap on who they are. So they are Muslims who reside in the Rakhine state. While they live in Myanmar, they do not have a citizenship, they do not have a Myanmar citizenship. And they are also very deeply rooted in the history of conflict because Myanmar is majority Buddhist and the Muslim people are not seen as very welcome there. So their response to the years of discrimination and problems that they've had was to form an insurgent group called ARSA, which is the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. So the group was formed to fight oppression, to bring awareness to their problems and their cause, as well as to get more help in the form of funds and volunteers, because the ARSA was made out of volunteers. So you fight for their cause if you truly believe in it. So nobody was forced to fight for them. So one of the very notable things that the ASA did was actually their attack on the multiple security outposts in Myanmar, in which they killed people and they also fled with weapons, and this led to the ethnic cleansing that happened. So we look at their actions from a teleological perspective. As we know, teleological perspective looks at the consequences of an action rather than the motives and intention of an action. So it produced a lot of bad consequences for the Rohingya people because their villages were burned down as a result of their actions. The people were slaughtered, women and girls were raped, and they were displaced from their homes. They fled to neighboring countries, all because of the actions of the Rohingya insurgent group known as ASA. So up next, I'll talk about the deontological perspective of their actions. So we know that deontological perspective looks at the actions of a consequence. They look at the actions rather than the consequences. So we look at the motives and intention of an action. So according to the rights theory, as stated by Osmo and Landau, the rights theory sees the only moral issue as being issues of rights and correlative duties to respect the rights of others. Essentially, it means that an ethical decision is one that does not infringe on the rights of other people. However, they respond to the discrimination and the violence against them by using more violence, therefore harming some people in the process of it. So it essentially infringing on the rights of the others. So up next, I'll be talking about a theory that was a reoccurring theme when we did our research. So it is the theory of ethical egoism, and I'll be analyzing it from all moral agents' perspective. So ethical egoism is made out of two parts: normative egoism and descriptive egoism. Normative egoism means that one ought to act in self-interest above others, and descriptive egoism means that human nature is entirely self-centered and never otherwise, as quoted from Mosley, no date given. So these two kinds of egoism come together to form ethical egoism, in which it is largely the pursuit of self-interest that is considered ethical. So from the perspective of the military, their carrying out of the ethnic cleansing was for a maximization of self-interest. They believe that it provided positive outcomes for the country made up of majority Buddhists, as they get to preserve their religious roots and the significance of it in their country. From the perspective of Facebook, we saw their actions when they decided to take measures to improve the situation that was happening on Facebook. So they did this in the pursuit of self-interest as well, as it improved their public image. It sends a message that they take ownership of their actions and they are committed to users to make their platform a safe one for their users. So from the perspective of the state media, we talked a little bit about agenda setting earlier, in which they set the agenda for people to think about certain issues or certain matters. So the state media actually aided in the military's efforts to pursue religious preservation, in which they got them to harbor a certain hate or intention towards the Rohingya people. However, this was for their own interest because the state media was owned by the military and the government. Therefore, they work hand in hand to achieve their desired outcome. So lastly, from the perspective of the Rohingya people, they are actually fighting for their own rights, as they wanted to stand up to their oppressors, thus forming the ASA army. So lastly, BQ will conclude this presentation. BQ, please.
Okay, thank you, Jay, and my fellow group members. To conclude, our group had a difficulty in justifying such extreme act in a neutral perspective, but we eventually did it in the end, because in any ethical dilemma, each moral agent is entitled to their own justification for the decision made and the actions taken. Ethical egoism is at the heart of each moral agent's motivation, as explained by Jay, and each moral agent will possess an element of self-interest and act in accordance to pursue the best outcome for themselves. If you look at the third person point of view, you might think that the Rohingya people are the victims. However, they did also use violence against violence. And in this situation, you have to look at both sides of the coin. So the discussion question we pose is that philosophers have created theories that basically explain the reasoning behind everything that was done in this situation. Is it therefore ethically justifiable or okay to do such things? Thank you.